Okay, so we're at a transitional point where a lot of interesting changes are happening, and that's mostly what I'll talk about today, is that period when the medieval is beginning to shift. The last thing we talked about was sort of the Gothic. We looked at Saint-Chapelle. But what I want to start looking at today, is the sculpture. Because when we get into the facade's 12th century, but it's really the 13th. Today, we're going to look at the 13th and 14th centuries. Those are the two centuries that are the transitional centuries. Now, we looked at this building, but what I want to look at is the sculpture on this building. This is Chartres Cathedral, which we looked at the interior and talked about, but I want to look at some sculpture here on the west facade, on the what are called the royal portals. Remember, the west entrance is called the royal entrance, or the royal portals, because that's where the king would go through if he ever visited. So let's look at the west portals, the royal portals. So I want to compare them to earlier medieval. First, since there's nobody actually on Zoom, we're going to move that out of the way down here in the corner. It's in terms of the structure is very similar to the Romanesque. 3 entrances symbolizing the Trinity, always have, one larger entrance in the middle. The sculpture is similarly located in the tympanum here, this sort of half moon, they called it, in the lintel. These are called the architraves, but we're not going to look at any of those. And then down here, the jamb figures. The jambs become really important places for sculpture. The door jambs, the sides of the door, and they're called jamb figures because this is where they are, because it's obviously you see them a lot better when you're entering the church than you see up in the tympanum. So we're going to look at some jamb figures on another building, but on this building, I just want to look at the tympanum here, the central figure, because it's really significant. What we have here in the center is Christ in his mandorla. Mandorla is this sort of oval form, almost egg-like form, which is sort of suggestive of something sort of holy. You see it actually in Buddhist imagery all the time. Figures are in mandorlas. It's just a way of sort of setting them off. And he's surrounded by the 4 evangelists. So we've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We've got our winged man, winged lion, winged ox, and winged eagle here of the 4 evangelists. Now, what's really interesting about this is the conception of it is very different than we saw in the Romanesque when we compared the tympanum. It's an interesting comparison between the Romanesque tympanum and the sort of late Gothic. First of all, we have a much more 3-dimensional conception of the figure. Remember, this guy, very flat, largely influenced by flat paintings or on walls or manuscripts. This is much more 3-dimensional and much more believable proportions. In just less than 200 years and a little over 100 years, you're getting a very different conception of the individual figure. But what I found most interesting is simply the way the narrative is told. Well, first of all, this isn't a narrative. This is a narrative, right? It's the Last Judgment. It's a story unfolding. Over here, we just get symbolic figures, Christ in the center, the 4 evangelists. But look how they've decided to organize the space. Here, it's chaos. It's chaos everywhere, jamming figures in. There's no real sense of order. There's an energy to it, a dynamic quality to it, where here we get a very simplified version with clear sections and organizations. It's a different mindset. And that suggests a sort of different spirituality. And that's what is happening. It's a different way of thinking about spirituality. The medieval way of thinking about religion and spirituality is one of sort of the absence of control. You don't know what's going on. You don't control anything. Don't ask any questions. You don't need to understand these things. And it's just a sort of a vast, dark world that's driven by this unknown. It's a very unknowable religion in the Middle Ages. You don't know it. You don't need to know it. You don't need to ask questions about it. In the Renaissance, it's going to begin to, and we're not there yet, but we're already seeing beginning changing the mindset where these ideas are more understandable. There's a clarity to how I'm going to tell you about these people. And that's the beginning of what will be a different way of thinking about it. And down in the lintels, we get sort of the apostles sort of from the Last Supper. And here we get, the chaos. I want to take a look at another set of portals because they're really more advanced. Remember, Chartres was early Gothic, so that was still very early. The Reims Cathedral, and Reims is a very important place. Reims is in northern France. It is the coronation church of the French kings. In the same way that Saint-Denis was the burial church of the French kings, this is the coronation church. So this is where the French kings were crowned, coronated, I guess is a word. Anyway, so it's an important church, and the west portals are important. But as you can see, it's a much more fully developed Gothic facade. It's deeply carved. It's richly ornate. The entranceways are much deeper. And interestingly, you could see one of those little doors here open. See, this is the door-sized door, and that's even a pretty big door, as opposed to the ceremonial doors, which is the great big ones, which probably would have been thrown open if there were, a royal procession or something, but otherwise they would never be open. You see late stained glass. There's no concrete in here at all. It's almost all glass. So there's a development of ideas, a rich sculpture. I had mentioned earlier that the cathedrals themselves were sort of symbolic mountains. So these are the caves. These entrances are very cave-like, and as they become deeper, the edges are sort of irregular, like entering a cave. That's important part of the symbolism. You also note that the plan is still there, but it's changed a lot. I mean, the transept is almost invisible because the choir is now so big that it almost eats up the whole transept. But let's look at the Reims facade, because some of the most famous figures in all of late Greek sculpture are on this building. And the ones I want to look at are these 4 figures right here. Really the most important entrance, jam figures right to the right of the door. So clearly these are important figures. Notice this one has a trumeau in the middle with sculpture on it. So let's look at these 4 jam figures. They're, like I said, they're very famous. There are 4 of them. They make up a single scene in the sense that there are 2 stories, 2 moments in time, the Annunciation and the Visitation, and we'll talk about them in a moment. But very typically, those 2 are often linked in art. There are many cases where you'll see the Annunciation with the Visitation. So the Annunciation is, of course, we've seen before, that's where Gabriel appears and announces to the Virgin Mary. Maybe we haven't seen it. Again, I'm out of time here. My mind is very confused chronologically, so maybe we haven't. But the Annunciation is Gabriel appears and announces to the Virgin Mary she will give birth to the Christ child. We're going to see plenty of them. And then the Visitation is a moment or a scene, if you want to think of it as a story unfolding, that follows right after that, where Mary goes to her cousin Elizabeth and tells her. That's called the Visitation. So Mary visits Elizabeth. Now, according to the Bible, Elizabeth is her cousin, but she's much older. And she's also already expecting. Elizabeth has her own story where she wasn't able to have children her whole life. And finally, when she's very, very old, she's finally pregnant, and everyone knows who her child is, right? John the Baptist, right? So those are the 2 stories, and that's why they're linked. Now, stylistically, they're very interesting as a group because we actually have 3 different artists working here, and 3 different styles, actually 2 primarily major styles, but then there are subtle differences. We have one artist made the angel, a different artist made Mary, and then the 3rd artist made both of the 2 figures on the right. And anybody should be able to see that these are strikingly different. Now let's talk about sort of how and why they're so different. So let's look at the Annunciation group first. The style on the left is one which we're going to be encountering again. I'll be talking about that today. It's what we call the French Gothic style. French Gothic, we're beginning to see now different styles developing in different nations. We've already encountered sort of a German style. We're going to see that much more as we go along. This is sort of a French style. It's very elegant, it's very soft, but it's also much more attached to the physical world than we've seen earlier. For one thing, there seems to be an attempt to suggest the body is standing in a position known as contrapposto. And if you remember way back when we were looking at Greek art, we talked about contrapposto. Greek sculpture stood this way. It's a way of putting your weight on one leg, and then the other leg then is bent and relaxed. It's a natural way people stand. We don't stand stiffly, equally balanced on two legs. We just don't do that. It's almost physically impossible to do that for very long. Your body wants to shift to one leg. And then typically if you're standing for more than a minute or two, you'll shift to back and forth between legs. And you're probably not even aware you're doing that. I want you to put that in your mind. Next time you're standing, talking to someone for a minute, see if you can be conscious about how you're standing and think about how you're doing that. But the problem is, this is a knee down here. The problem is, it is still the Middle Ages. You know, he may be thinking about sort of a classical way of, you know, accurately showing a figure, but he hasn't studied the human body, and there's no sense of real proportion, not much of a real sense of the body underneath of this drapery. So the knee is way down here, which is very awkward. So the body is, you know, misproportioned. The drapery is hanging in a very Greek manner, actually, in that it seems to be very natural, but it's more elegant than it is natural. He's more concerned that it hang beautifully than he is that it hang in a natural way. And again, I'll remind you of some Greek like relief sculpture we looked at on the Parthenon, where the guy had his arms out and there was this drape hanging over his arms, and it was absolutely beautiful, but it made no connection to reality. It wouldn't be hanging there. It would, you know, drapery is rarely as beautiful as people make it in art.
Why one way?
Well, that's an excellent question. Okay. I'm fairly sure it just broke.
It broke.
Now, is it typical that these historic places would not repair the arms, the hands, the wing, that they wouldn't replace the wing?
It's not typical for things to break on a Gothic cathedral, because they're not usually, you don't usually have like free pieces sticking out like that wing. Okay. I'm only assuming it broke. I don't know that as a fact. My assumption is it broke because it just looks weird the way it is now.
But their hands are missed. Their hands
have broken, right? But it's not uncommon. So that does make sense that it could have. So possibly they repaired it, it broke again. I mean, it's possible, because when you repair something like this, it may not be a very strong repair. If the last time it broke was in the 19th or 20th century, they would not have repaired it. So that seems like a possible scenario. That, I mean, sometimes they'll put up like a clear plaster one. Sometimes you'll look at an old sculpture and like an arm or something will be like bright white and everything else is a different color. That's done on purpose so that you know this is a modern addition, just to let you know what it looked like. But honestly, I don't know the answer to that. The Mary on the right is somewhat similar. Hi, we have somebody. Mary on the right is somewhat similar in the drapery, but it is a different set of proportions to the body, which is why they believe it's a second artist. But the one on the left, the angel, is the more French Gothic style. And we'll look at other works and we'll see why that is. Now let's look at these two. Now these are the two that are very, very telling. And we're talking about 1250 here. So this is still clearly in the Middle Ages. But whoever sculpted these, and we don't know because these still are anonymous people, has clearly been looking at classical sculpture, has clearly been looking at Greek and Roman design. I would say Roman design more than anything else. This is based on Roman sculpture. The idea earlier in the Middle Ages, that you would do anything to emulate these pagan ancients was unthinkable, in earlier Middle Ages. Simply the fact that he's out there looking at them and referencing them says something, says that things are changing, that it seems to be okay. He's not in trouble. This is on the most important church that existed at this time. And so clearly no one had a problem with these references. The other things we see, first of all, there are attempts at contrapposto. Both of them are attempting to show weight on one leg. You see these strange knees with the proportions being off. There's also clearly an attempt at individuation of the face. You can't call it portraiture exactly, because nobody knows what these people would have looked like. So we can't go so far as to say portrait, but they are trying to show a younger woman, an older woman. They're trying to give individual qualities and characteristics to their features, which is totally not a medieval thing at all. The drapery is hanging in a much rougher, cruder way, but in reality, a more natural way. It's not always as elegant as we would want. It's more often like this, somewhat irregular and jagged. When we put them, well, here's a comparison to Roman sculpture. Now, we didn't look at this particular relief piece, but this is a Roman sculptural relief from the time of Augustus. So this would date to, it was the Roman piece, so probably around 10 or 20 of the Common Era. Then this was sculpted. It's images of the imperial family. So these were real portraits of relatives of Augustus. And you can see how similar they are in terms of the way the drapery is fallen, in more natural ways, the stances, etc. So this is what this artist has been looking at, things like this piece, and all of them together makes this really interesting but strange combination. I mean, we would never do that. To our eye, it's odd to put four so different figures together and link them, but clearly, I mean, they're only 10 years apart. So it's not so much a difference in the 10 years things have changed. It's a difference in conceptions. One was done by a French artist. One was clearly done, maybe he was French, but he'd spent a lot of time in Italy. He'd traveled in Italy, he'd seen things there, and he brought back ideas which were being accepted in France at this time. I want to show you now two of my absolute favorite Gothic pieces, which couldn't be more different from one another. For the first is this really beautiful Virgin and Child. It's one of the most famous pieces of Gothic art from Saint-Denis. It was a gift to the Church of Saint-Denis from the French Queen, Jeanne d'Evreux. Jeanne d'Evreux is a very famous person in French history. She was, let's see, she was married to Charles, and I can't remember the number, when she was like 12 years old, which is not uncommon. When this was commissioned just a few years earlier, she was the French queen, but by the time when she donated this was right after her husband died, so she wasn't the queen any longer. But we have a number of works of art that had belonged to her. She was a real patron of the arts. The Book of Hours, the very, very famous Book of Hours of Jeanne d'Evreux, as it's known. A Book of Hours is like a private prayer book. It's called the Book of Hours, and we have hers, and it's a very famous work of art. And if we had lots of time, there's lots more things I would show you, but this was donated by her. It is a reliquary. It holds a strand of the hair of the Virgin Mary. That's its role. As you can see, it's about 27 inches high. It's gilded silver, so it's made of silver covered in gold. There's also some jewels. There's enameling on the base and jewels and the like. And she's holding a fleur-de-lis. It's a little difficult to see, but there's a scepter here. This is the continuation of that 12th and 13th century attempt to link the French royal family to the church, making that link, which is what made, them so powerful in the Gothic period. This is a continuation of that. The fleur-de-lis was a symbol of the French royal family, so Mary's holding it, so obvious messages here. It's a unique piece, a very transitional piece. It's elegant, it's very French. If you study art for very long, you can look at a piece instantly and know that is French, that is Italian, that's German, that's Spanish, that's British, that's American. And after a while, you can't mistake them. There's just qualities that are there. And this is deeply French. Couldn't have been made by anybody else.
Is that only for historical things or even into modern times?
It's a cultural thing. And I think there are ways you can see it in language, because I've had to study a lot of languages, not that I remember most of them, but I've had to at one point know a lot of these languages. And I reached the point where I could see the cultural qualities in the language, the way grammar is structured. I mean, to me, the essential character of Germanness is putting the verb at the end of a sentence. I think that is such a German thing to do. Have you studied German, anybody?
Well, you always hear about those German words that are just like 4 or 5 words.
Well, that's another thing they do. Well, that's the one thing I loved about the German language is you're free to invent words. They won't let you do that in English. If it's not in the dictionary, that's not a word. It doesn't work that way. In German, if you want to take this word, this word, this word, and this word, and put them together to create this much more complex idea, you're free to do that. And I love that. But no, the verb at the end of the sentence keeps you hanging. It's a very sort of controlling thing. It's like, to the market on Monday with my friend Martha, we will go. And like, you're hanging on, like, what are you talking about? You have to wait till the very end to find out what you're talking about. And it can be very frustrating, but there's something about it that just speaks to that sense of focus. It's an intense focus. And anyway, that's probably totally wrong and biased, but
it's one French characteristic of this piece, something that tells one thing that tells you it's French. Is it so much, I don't know, draping?
The elegance,
Yeah,
that's
elegance,
the
thank
word.
you.
That's the word.
Okay.
It's that S curve, it's right out of classical Greek art too, but it's soft. Everything is totally idealized. The essence of French art, and we'll be talking about this more later because we'll see it for hundreds of years. The French hold on to their classical ideal well into they're the only ones in the 17th century who are still holding on to idealism, perfection. And this is that elegant, perfect form. That's very deeply French, and they will always identify with it. In fact, as we will see, they will attack art that French artists make if it doesn't do that. It's foreign art. They call it foreign. If you're not doing it this way, it's like foreign invasion in the art world. But this is very, very French.
And the material also is top of the line.
It's just
Gold and
fluid.
silver.
It's the queen, it's for the important church, so you're going to have the best. But I want you to look, number one, the elegance. Look at her neck, how this long necks. And this is something I found like all around the world. I've encountered it almost everywhere. The idea of a long neck is beautiful. The beauty in a long neck. It's one of the few universal things I've encountered that identify beauty. And I've seen it in Africa, Asia, it's everywhere. And so it's exaggerated, but the tilt of the head creates this long swoop to create this long S. Just stunning. But I also want you to look at that child. Look at the proportions of that child. That is the most accurate proportions of a Christ child we have seen in more than a thousand years. This is very, we're getting closer and closer to naturalism. And that's a very good example of it. It's usually seen or interpreted as being influenced by this particular sculpture. The far left figure, Angel Gabriel, was the influence for this. And you can see it in the stance, in the drapery, and all of the rest. It's very much the French Gothic style. Well, here, I forgot I had all this. She's known as the Virgin of Tenderness. There are all sorts of different references. This is the Virgin of Humility, the Virgin of Compassion, the Virgin of Tenderness. They're all related to, gestures she's making or her physical stance, whatever. This is a gesture of tenderness. And this is something that is new. He's reaching out and touching her chin. There's an intimacy there that we haven't seen before. It's usually been the cold Queen of Heaven, right? But this is different, and this is going to be influential in the next century as well.
Is that still at Saint Church?
Saint Denis, I am not sure.
Probably not.
Good question. I don't know.
They don't adore those
It's-
churches very
It
much.
may be too important and too valuable. Should be in. I would hope it would be in a museum for those exact reasons. Now, I want to juxtapose that to my other favorite piece, and that is the German Gothic piece, the Pietà. Let's see, this one was 27 inches, so this is slightly larger. It's wooden. That's another thing you don't see much of, wooden sculpture throughout Western history. It is a Pietà. It's known as the Vesper build. First of all, say something about the Pietà. Pietà literally means pity. It is a new subject in art, and it has no biblical context. It's an invented scene that combines different moments in the life of Christ. There is no biblical moment when Mary sits on a throne and holds Christ, the dead Christ, on her lap. There are scenes where she's holding the baby Christ on her lap, and there are scenes where she is with him after the crucifixion. But what we're getting is a made-up scene that merges first and last moments in the life of Christ. It's meant to be a scene encapsulating the entire life of Christ. So that's why it's neither here nor there. It's neither early nor late. It's a merging of moments. The reference to pity is meant to link Mary and Christ. We're going to see in the 13th, well, this is 14th century, in the 14th and even into the 15th century, we see a lot of works of art that attempt to link Mary and Christ, that link their lives, link what they went through. And in this case, it's meant to link their suffering. So who's suffering here? Who do we feel pity for? Well, both of them. Mary, because she's holding her son, her dead son, and of course, Christ, but actually mostly Mary. This is associated particularly with the prayer, the Hail Mary prayer, and also with Vesper services. When I talked about I didn't talk much about it, but I talked about monks and the 8 hours of prayer, or the 8 times within a 24-hour period when they go to pray. Well, Vespers is the evening hour. Vespers is at sundown. And each one of those 8 hours is associated with a particular prayer, and Vespers is associated with the Hail Mary. So that's what this is. That's why it's called the Vesper Bild. Bild just means picture in German. So the Vesper Bild is an image of the Vespers prayer, the Vespers hour, and it's a powerful image, and it's very, very German. It's very real. Now I'm going to say this is realism. This is idealism, and they're very different. We use I know in common language, in common speak, we call that realistic, and I wouldn't yell at you if you did, but when you're really talking about artistic styles, that's not how we use the word in art. We distinguish between them. This is naturalism, but it's not real. It's an idealized view. This is real, even though it's a distorted view, but it's not hiding anything. Realism is truth telling. And I think that's the best way to remember it. Truth telling, not pulling punches, not cleaning it up, not making it pretty, but giving you the gut wrenching emotion of a moment in time. And that's what you have here. And they're even like exaggerating it, the way the neck is sort of overly done. This is blood pouring out, of the wounds. It's over the top. And that's German art. Nobody else would have made this. Nobody else made art like this. Not before the 19th century. Nobody but Germans would have made anything this real, this passionate, this emotional. And it's very, very powerful. It's why I love it. I think they're both beautiful works of art, but for two very different reasons. But what I love about them, what they have in common, is they are both a perfect example of a place and time. One's a perfect moment of France, one's a perfect moment of Germany. They're both expressions of their culture. And that, as a historian, an art historian, that's what interests me. That's what I'm looking for. You know, what
The
can you,
medallions on the German piece.
Yeah.
They're significant.
I don't know, but I can guess. This, I say German, but there was no Germany. We're talking about a location that would have been within the Holy Roman Empire. And I suspect it may be symbols relating to whoever was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire at that time, because they're reminiscent of sort of like the Tudor rose symbolism that you find in British architecture and design. They remind me of that. So don't quote me, I don't know that, but logically, I believe that that's what they are.
What do you think about which of these two styles would you call Michelangelo's great?
Well,
Hmm?
Michelangelo, well, definitely the French Gothic because of its connection. He's not either of these. I mean, he skips over all this period and jumps right back to the Hellenistic world. Remember the Laocoon coming out of and his sons who are being attacked and the snakes are winding around him. That's where Michelangelo's getting his source. He's skipping all these guys and going back to classics. That's what they're doing in the Renaissance. They jump over the Middle Ages. They don't even want to think about the Middle Ages. Okay, so let's talk about painting. In the 13th and 14th century. Now I want to jump to Italy because we're going to be in Italy for quite a while now. And we're doing that. We're making the jump before we get out of the Middle Ages, because this is where the changes are happening. And there are a number of reasons why these changes become more pronounced in Italy than anywhere else. Now, first of all, let me clarify, I'm saying Italy. Understand there was no Italy. That's a modern country. When I say Italy, I'm usually referring to any of these little republics and duchies in this part, in this area. I'm not including the Republic of Venice. Venetian art is its own thing and we cover it separately, and definitely nothing in the South because the Kingdom of Naples is its whole thing. And they're still independent here, but through much of history, they're part of Spain and they're going to be part of Spain for a long time. So when I say Italy, I'm talking about this area from the Papal States, basically from Rome, all the way up to a sort of Milan in this area. So I'm going to collectively refer to it as Italy, but we will look at different areas from here. So one of the main things that is different in Italy is that the guild systems are much weaker. Always were. You know, the guild system where you have, you know, workshops and masters and people controlling what's done, that really originates in Europe in the North, and it's very strong in the North. It's weaker in the South, particularly in Italy. They were never quite as strong, which right away gives artists a little more freedom. Even at this early day, Italian artists are working independently. They're not all working through, you know, workshops. They're taking commissions from wealthy families and wealthy patrons, and there are a lot of them. After the Crusades, when trade is more open between East and West, Italy began economically recovering before Western Europe did. And you get a lot of merchants and traders and others in Italy who are becoming wealthier. And when the economy begins to change, that changes everything. We get civic development that is more advanced in Italy. So there are a number of reasons why all these changes are welcomed more in Italy. And I want to look at just one example of a sculpture. Again, this is all transitional work from the 13th century. This is a pulpit designed and created by Niccolo Pisano. It's in the Pisa Baptistry. And it's modeled on Roman sarcophagi. That's another reason Italy. We're talking about Roman influence. We're sitting right in Italy. I mean, this is the home of the Roman Empire. It's always going to be more open to influence from ancient Rome. This isn't like way up in the north. So that classical influence is going to be there and never really leave. But I want to look at just the detail of the Annunciation here, because we see in it some interesting things that are new, but also interesting things that are still medievalisms. First of all, it's a continuous narrative. And a continuous narrative is when multiple scenes from a given storyline are all together in the same scene. Like within one frame, I'll have 3 moments in a story all being shown together. That's called a continuous narrative. And you can always recognize it because the same person will appear more than once. When you have a person in a scene 3 different times or 4 different times, it's a continuous narrative because it's suggesting different moments. And we have the Virgin Mary here 3 times, because while it's usually referred to as the Annunciation, it really includes the Annunciation, the Nativity, and the presentation at the temple. And so we have 3 Marys. Here's the Virgin Mary, here's the Virgin Mary, and here's the Virgin Mary. So up in this corner, we have the Annunciation, right? Here's Angel Gabriel announcing to Mary, and she's pulling back, which we often see. Pretty much this whole half, or almost the whole half, is the Nativity. So we have Mary here and the Christ child and angels and, other animals and visitors. So this is all the Nativity. And then down here, this little group is the visitation at the temple, or presentation at the temple, pardon me. Jewish law, child is born, they're brought to the temple. And this is when they're sort of officially members of the church, etc. So this is the present. He's getting his ceremonial bath, etc. But I want to look at, first of all, the medieval element to it is it's pure chaos. I mean, there are figures everywhere. There's no, it's not clear. Figures blend into other figures. They don't worry about that. That creates something more dynamic and active and energetic. What's new about it is, again, the naturalism of the features. They're very rounded forms. They're very solid, very 3-dimensional figures. There's a naturalism to the proportions, to the drapery. So all of that is new. Again, it's a very, very typical 13th century Italian style, merging these various new and traditional scenes. I want to remind you of a Byzantine style. Now, this isn't Italian, this is Byzantine, but it's a late Byzantine. It's not an icon. Notice it's 32 inches high. It's too big to be an icon. What we're seeing now is we're on the cusp of the beginning of large-scale painting, something we haven't really had since going back to Roman wall painting. We really haven't had, other than in churches. But anyway, remind you of Byzantine, because the Italians are very aware of Byzantine art, and it is going to have an influence. So this is sort of the Byzantine style by the 13th century. We have Mary as the Queen of Heaven with the Christ child. Now we have this very, very flat, notice how flat everything is. The only place it's not flat is the face and the hands. There's attempt at modeling there, but the rest of it's very flat. And then you get these sort of starburst effect, which is very Byzantine, as if light is hitting it, and then these gold striations are coming out to the side, seated on this elegant throne that, to me, always looks more like a giant amphitheater than a throne, right? It looks like the Colosseum as much as anything else, but it's Byzantine, and there's no Roman works there. So I have no idea. I don't know the details of how people interpret this, but it is meant to symbolize, at the very least, a throne. And so there's nothing intimate between them. It's that typical Queen of Heaven motif. But the Italians are aware of that. And Italian painters are late in the 13th century and in the 14th are going to develop their own style, a late Gothic style. And this is the new altar pieces and altar panels. So we're going to talk more about those. It begins to be a tradition now that over the main altar of the church, you have a large painting. That's new. You didn't see that in those very, very dark churches from earlier periods, but this is going to revive painting. No more fears of the graven image in the way we had before. And then the gold helps in the same way that gold in mosaics helped, so does gold in paintings. So these are painted very much like Byzantine icons are painted. They're wooden panels painted with tempera paint and then gold leafing. So the materials are pretty much the same. They're just much, much bigger. So again, a lot of people probably helped with this, even though, look what we have. Cimabue, that is an artist's name. When have we last seen an artist's name? And not for a long time. This is Italy. Italians want to be known. You know, Italian, I can't remember which Italian artist said it, and I don't even remember which century. It might have been 15th century, but Italian artists would openly tell you their number one goal is to be famous. It's not to make great art. It's not, it's not any of those things. It's to be famous. And you got to be known for that to happen. So Cimabue was very famous, one of the earliest working in the style. Now, this is an interesting piece. We get the Queen of Heaven on an elegant throne, Christ child, she's gesturing to him. That's not an uncommon gesture, with angels hovering around the throne. And these are Old Testament prophets. We see medievalism here in the basic motif, of course, is very much like the one we saw before. We even see some remnants of those sort of striations, those very stylized ways of showing sort of light hitting the surface of the garment. But it's the space I want to talk about. First of all, when we look at the 4 Old Testament prophets and try and read the space that they are in, we see that these two guys are clearly under arches, which makes us read this as being under an arch, as going like over their heads, right? It's an architectural form. When we look at just the top, we see this curve here at the base of her throne, which clearly implies it's curving back into space, right? This space at her feet is a curve this way. But when we put them together, we see this very ambiguous relationship between these architectural elements that are almost impossible to read. It's almost an illusion. Are we supposed to read this arch as following this and going back in space? Or are we supposed to read it as going up in space, in which case this becomes ambiguous? These two forms don't fit together architecturally in believable space. What this tells me is that he is very interested in creating spatial truth, spatial illusions, and carving them out. He just doesn't know how to do it yet. He's not confident enough with how to use these forms to be able to tell you this story. And even a little thing like that is strikingly different from the completely flat images we've seen throughout the Middle Ages, just the beginning of concern. We also have some concern with showing the angels spatially behind the throne and maybe moving around it, but at the same time, they're sort of floating up in the air, which is really okay because they're angels and angels have wings, and if they can float in the air, so it's not big of a problem. Now, what really is interesting is what happens immediately after this, because Cimabue had a student, and his student's name was Giotto. And when Giotto comes along and creates this very different style from his teacher, Cimabue finds himself almost overnight going from being the most sought after painter in Florence to someone who's losing all of his commissions to Giotto. And that fact alone tells us People want something different. People are ready for a change. They want what Giotto's doing. Cimabue looks old-fashioned now. And let's look at what Giotto is doing. First of all, he is very influenced by Franciscan values. Franciscan order was founded in 1209. So earlier than this, about 100 years earlier. But by the beginning of the 14th century, the Franciscans are very influential. The Franciscans are an interesting order because first of all, they're not monks. We refer to them as monks, but they're not, they're friars. And there's a difference between monks and friars. Monks are cloistered. Friars are not. The Franciscans were not cloistered. They might have lived together and called it a monastery, but they went out into the world every day. They were not, in fact, their whole reason for being was going out into the world and being among people and doing good works among people. It's very different from monastic orders whose goal was to isolate themselves from the world. So they're friars, not monks. They look similar and the places they live look similar, but there is a difference. They emphasize experience and observation. The Franciscans emphasize several things: humility, simplicity, observation, and experience. So being simple and humble, that's pretty obvious, and that's going to affect art and basically culture in Italy to a great extent. But also the idea of experience and going out and look. You want to know something? Well, go look, find out. That's, you know, in the Middle Ages, you were told, don't go out and look and find out. I'm telling you how things work. You're not supposed to ask questions about them. Now people are being told, go out and look, find out, experience the world. That's very different. Giotto did a lot of work for different Franciscan monasteries. Now, they still called them that, did paintings in monasteries. So he had a lot of interaction with Franciscans, and we know that he was personally very inspired. So what we've got here is a very different conception. This is what happens when you look at the world as opposed to guessing what the world looks like. We still have angels, figures around the throne, but they're now much more grounded. They're not floating up in the air. They're sort of literally more behind one another, as if you feel more that they're grounded. And especially these two figures in the front, kneeling on the ground. These are firmly grounded figures. And it's still slightly an ambiguous space because of what he's doing down here. You know, we know we're supposed to read this as coming out toward us, but it's a bit awkward, you know, but still, and talk about a solid three-dimensional form. I mean, that's like a boulder, you know, a big granite boulder. She is very, very solid three-dimensional form with a lot of modeling, you know, a lot of shadow here, a lot of highlight in the forms. Now, it's noticeable mostly when you look at them side by side, how ephemeral Cimabue's is, how much more like the Byzantine it is. And I forgot to define some of these terms. Maniera Greca. Maniera Greca means Greek style, but what they meant by that was Byzantine style. Remember, the Byzantines spoke Greek. So in Latin-speaking Italy, if you referred to something as Greek, you really meant the Byzantines, not the ancient Greeks. You weren't really, so Greek manner or Greek style meant Byzantine style. And it's very light and ephemeral compared to the solid forms of Giotto. And of course, the most interesting part of it is the fact that he was popular. You know, one of the things we do study in art is reception. It's called reception theory. And it's looking at how people received the art at the time. What did the people then think about the art? What did they prefer? Because that tells you a great deal. And the fact that they prefer Giotto says there's a direction we're moving. And so this idea that the Renaissance is going to be born overnight in this year is ridiculous. We're still 100 years away from it, and we're seeing clear movement toward greater and greater naturalism. In fact, you know, 15th century Italian painters are going to admit Giotto is the biggest influence on them. They're going to be very influenced by him. Now let's talk about other things. The 13th century was transitions were beginning, but in the 14th, we're getting a lot more happening in the culture, particularly in the rise of humanism, something we associate with the Renaissance, but it's there, it's in the air. Things are often in the air, you know. I would love to live longer, only for the fact that I want to look back 100 years from now and see what this culture looks like from 100 years in the future. That's the reason to want to live longer. I can't think of any other good reason to do it, but it's because we can't see, nobody sees their own world. Nobody really understands the complexity of the world you live in. You need distance, you need hindsight to be able to look at it. So we now can see these changes in the 14th century. So humanism is beginning, and it's challenging medieval ideas. Dante is writing, these are the three most important writers of the 14th century. First of all, he's writing in the vernacular, we'll talk about that in a minute, about human-centered earthly affairs. I mean, that's really the importance of the Divine Comedy by Dante. Number one, it's written in Italian. Vernacular just means the common language. Everyone wrote in Latin. You didn't write literature in this common local tongue. You just didn't do that. This made it approachable to anybody. And it's also focusing on earthly affairs as opposed to just spiritual affairs. Petrarch, we're going to talk more about Petrarch later because he really is the voice of the Renaissance. 15th century will all look to Petrarch, but he's very much encouraging the study of the ancients, not just accepting them, but telling you to study them. And we'll talk about why he did that later and why that was so important. Boccaccio is emphasizing our ability to overcome. That's not a medieval idea. He's saying, you can do it. You're not just a puppet. You don't have to do, you know, this way, you know, you can overcome these things. That is the antithesis of a medieval sensibility where you were supposed to just accept this is the will of God. This is the way things are. You're a serf, don't question it, do your job. Boccaccio is saying, you don't have to do this. You don't have to be that way. All of that is going to fit into the new ideals. And the humanist element of it is simply the man-centered element of it, that we are the masters of our fate. They're not saying that yet. That's a little early. They're going to say that after 1400, but not in the 1300s, but it's moving in that direction. Now, Giotto, so Giotto's around and he's getting all the commissions, and he got a very important commission by the Scrovegni family to do the entire interior program of this chapel, this sort of small freestanding chapel that was commissioned and built by the Scrovegni family. They did it to, in a sense, get back into good favor with the Pope. The Scrovegni family got in trouble for usury, which is lending money and charging too high interest rates. And they were in trouble for that with the church, actually. And to get in better graces, they donated, you know, they built this and basically gave it sort of to the church. So that's where it comes from. We know it as the Arena Chapel. Its real name is the Scrovegni Chapel, but it's always called, even at the time, it was called the Arena Chapel because it was built right next door to an old Roman arena. So it was always, you know, that chapel next to the arena. So it was called the Arena Chapel. So that's what everybody calls it. Rarely did an artist get the commission to do the whole interior. Usually when you have churches like this where you have different scenes, there'll be different artists, sometimes from different centuries. I mean, we're going to see that actually in the Sistine Chapel. It's full of images, but there's lots of different artists have art there. But he got the whole thing so he could lay it all out as a unified program. And that's what we have. It's a systematic program of stories from the life of Christ and the life of the Virgin Mary. So we're going to look at a couple of them. First of all, one thing should strike you just looking at this image. There's one color that is very dominant here. Blue. Why do we see so much blue?
Because it's expensive.
What color of his background here? It's not gold, it's
What's real?
blue. These are taking place in the real world. He's giving us biblical scenes, not with some gold leaf background of some taking those stories out of reality and making them some great metaphor. This is coming down to the physical world and telling these stories as they would happen to real people in the real world. That is a dramatic change that, you know, if you didn't know about it, there was no way, you couldn't just intuit that walking into this chapel. You'd have to really kind of understand how revolutionary this really is. Now, first of all, these are frescoes, and I want to talk a bit about fresco. Fresco process of painting is not new. In fact, we looked at a fresco a long time ago, way back when we were looking at the ancient world and we were looking at Minoan culture, and we looked at this bull leaping. Remember the bull leaping fresco from Crete? You know, it's this leaping bull and you flipped over the bull, right? That was like 1500 BCE. That was a fresco. Frescoes aren't new. They're one of the oldest media. They weren't as popular in the Middle Ages because of the imagery. They didn't make big images, but they're coming back into favor, and they'll be very popular through the Renaissance and into the Baroque, really up into the 18th century a little bit, but mostly 15th. It's going to really be almost everything in the 15th century. So let's talk about fresco and what it is. Fresco is not just wall painting. You can't just go paint on a wall. That won't be a fresco. It's how it's made. You know, all paint has a binder, right? Tempera paint uses egg yolk as a binder. You can have water and pigment and mix them together, but you can't paint with that. I mean, you can, but it's not going to bind to anything. It's going to dry and fall off the wall. You need something mixed in paint to bind pigment and medium together. It's going to be things like egg yolk. It's usually natural emulsions. Artists have used egg yolk, egg white. They've used milk. Casein paint uses milk. All those things are natural emulsions, meaning they're a natural mix of oil and water, so they bind. Or you can use, not yet, they haven't begun using it. You can use oil, linseed oil, the oil paint, but that hasn't started yet. It will soon, and we'll talk about why that's so important when they start using oil paint. But fresco, the binder in fresco is not something you add. The paint binds to the wall surface through a chemical process. It's a chemical process that takes place, and it's a process in which you use lime as a plaster. Now, any artist who worked in fresco, out in the back of their workshops, they would have a lime pit. And a lime pit is a big hole in the ground that you pour powdered lime into and add water, mix it up so that it could slake. Slaking the lime is something you go through. And the longer it goes through this process, the better the quality of the lime putty that you get from it. So some of these workshops that were going on for maybe 100 or more years, they would have lime pits that were that old. So it's just a matter of constantly adding more lime, more water, whatever. So any chemists out here? I'm always interested in the chemistry of things, because I'm interested in like the firing of pots and what happens in different kilns. And I'm interested in this chemistry because I just learn a lot doing this. So limestone, it's pure limestone, is calcium carbonate. And when you compress it and expose it to really hot heat, you get calcium oxide, which is lime. Lime comes from compressing and heating limestone. So now you've got lime and it's a powder. And that's what you put in the pit. And then when you add water to it, it makes calcium hydroxide, right? Hydroxide for water. And then you mix that up. And that we also call that lime putty. Now, when you're ready to create the wall, because the fresco is done when the wall is plastered, it's part of the building process usually. So you have layers of plaster. The lower layers have more sort of grit in them. The closer it comes to the surface, the finer the layer. And typically the very top layer or the intonaco layer usually has just marble dust. I mean, it's very, very fine. So the second to the last layer, which is the oricio layer, so it's all plastered, And that's when the artist comes in, and the artist will take a little bit of this lime putty and spread it on a small section of the wall. And then while it's wet, paint with it, but with just a mixture of water and pigment. There's no binder in what he's painting because the binding will happen when that wall dries. So you're painting on when it's wet. And as you can see, these little sections, each one of these little sections is what's called a giornata, or one day. Giornata means one day, one day's work. And the way you paint a fresco is you basically work across. You work, here's a section, here's a section, here's a section. Now, when it's all finished, at the time, you wouldn't see these little sections, but as they've aged, they've become visible again. And most older frescoes, when you look at them, they have, you can see all these little lines that identify one day's work. So it takes about 8 hours for it to dry. So you come in, lay down however much you think you can paint, you paint it, and then you let it dry. In the process, as it dries, it's exposed to carbon dioxide. That's the process that chemically bonds the pigment to the wall. And it's not on the wall, it's in the wall. It's a very stable paint. We have frescoes, you know, like going back to 1500 BCE. In fact, the colors in fresco intensify over time, and they look their best about 100 years after they were made, which is really sad because no artist ever gets to see his best work. I just found that so sad. Now, sometimes they make a mistake. Let's say, I think I can paint this much today before it starts drying. Well, what if I'm wrong and I can only get part of it's starting to dry? It's a little too dry when I paint it. Well, you could probably let that go and it would be all right for 50 years. Eventually, however, that's going to chip off because it didn't bond properly to the wall. And there are two ways to fix that. If you're a good artist, you want to fix that now. You don't want to say, well, I won't be here when it falls off. But there are two ways to repair it. You can either chip it out and just do it properly, or you can do what's called secco fresco. Buon means true. So buon fresco is true fresco. That's when it's done correctly and it's bonded to the wall. Secco, which means dry, is where you come back with a little lime water and you paint over that spot with lime water and then paint it, and it sort of bonds to the wall. You know, it's a thin bond, and it's probably good for a couple hundred years. But when you walk today into an old fresco, it's, you know, there's going to be little chips, and you wonder, how did those little chips happen? Those are secco areas that they didn't do correctly, and they fell off. Most of this is in good shape. He did it. He did a good job. So it's a laborious process. When I was in grad school, I had a class where we had to reproduce materials and techniques from history. We had to learn how to not only make our own paint, which is simple. A lot of artists make their own paint today still. We had to make ink and learned how to make ink, which was really fun because you have to burn a lot of different kinds of wood and then use different wood ash, and it smells really good in the process. And we did gold leafing. And we made a fresco, just a small fresco. We had like a little box and had plaster. And the one thing I remember from making that fresco is the heat that comes off of it. I mean, you read about it, but it's intense. It's like opening the oven door and standing in front of it. As it dries, what it's putting off is heat. And so keep that in mind when you think about what that room would have felt like, what Michelangelo was experiencing painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which is pure hell, which we'll talk about later. But it was just really unpleasant conditions making it. And we just had a little box like this. So yeah, it's a difficult process, but a very, if done right, it's very secure.
Wouldn't it be challenging to manage, well, to match the colors from day to day? Like if he did part of the sky one day and then the next day he's got to mix the blue.
I would say they probably, I know what some artists do today is you mix the pigment ahead of time. Like it's, you have to be scientific about it. You have to like, not necessarily mix it with the water, but mix the powdered pigments that you know are the color you want. And then you've got this big stock of that mixed pigment that you can go to every day.
Okay.
So to be sure you're getting the same color, that would be the logical way to do it. And it seems fairly easy to do it that way,
Do
because
you
you're
think
not,
we're looking at the original fresco here, or has the color been added over the
no,
years?
no, this is original, absolutely original. Yeah, they'll stay. Yeah, like I said, we've got it from 1000 BCE that are this intense.
Well, sometimes they chip off what's left over, or I guess they always chip off what's left over at the end of the day, if you didn't get.
Well, if you know, yes, if you know you're not going to get to it, the problems with the ones that they think they got in time, but they didn't. Those are the problematic ones. But if they know they're stopping, they're going to absolutely, you're right, chip it off to be fresh, to have a good place to start for the next day. This particular grouping, everything you're seeing here is fresco. Nothing, I mean, it looks as if there's inlaid materials here, so there's not. That's painted. This is all paint.
Do they use a brush?
Yeah, yeah, a regular kind of, it's actually very sensual experience because you're painting on like a kind of soft surface, and it's really very pleasant experience because the brush is very different from a hard surface you're brushing on. It's just sort of, yeah, it's very fun. Except for, you know, all the things that aren't fun. So we've got different biblical scenes here. In this case, we've got the first miracle over here. This is Lazarus. This is the lamentation. Whoops, we're going to look at that in a second. And this, of course, the resurrection. But let's look at the lamentation, because it's not only the sort of solid forms here that he gives us. There is a simplicity here. There's a lot of figures, but there's not a lot of unneeded things. There's not a lot of decoration or ornate elements. It's also very different in its sort of composition. First, you can see all the little lines that separate the different giornata that are visible now. But he uses this device through all of the images. And we back up for a second. Notice how they're all consistent spatially. They're all the same scale. You've got sort of this rock that goes up here and comes down here. So because he does multiple scenes, he can link them in ways that you don't get that sort of uniformity. The figure with their back to you, I mean, this is totally unheard of. Nobody'd ever, you don't paint figures with their back to you. And yet we don't have a problem understanding this, right? We know how to read it. They're sitting kind of in a circle. Just turning the figure around creates the illusion of space. It creates this illusion of space in front and in back. The rock draws your eye right down here. It's interesting that our focal point is way down here in the corner. That is not a typical compositional device. It's a very dynamic compositional device. But he's really thinking about multiple scenes and leading your eye through not just one scene, but into the next scene and into the next scene. And the rock plays a role in that. We still get the halos, that's sort of an older fashioned style. You're not going to see that so much in the Renaissance, but I love this guy. This is one of my favorites. Look at this hand back here. How does he want us to interpret that? Is there a hand growing out of his neck? That's what it looks like. No, obviously, we know that this arm, we're supposed to read that arm as if it's coming toward you and that arm going back, and you just see the hand, but it's not done right. This arm is like bent back and you get a hand here. So you can see what he's trying, and it won't be long that they'll figure out how to do that right, but it's the attempt that matters. It's that he cared and he wanted to show that. And then I love, you know, the angels flipping every which way. I mean, it's really a wonderful scene in so many different ways, and drama, emotion to a great extent. So beautiful image. Also in Italy from this period, we get a different style developing, and that is Duccio's style. It's called the Sienese style. It's a style that developed in Siena, Italy. And it's a style that merges It's a little bit of French Gothic merged with Byzantine, and then a little bit of Giotto's sensibility of space in there. And that's called the Sienese style. And it was the most popular style of the 14th century. This is the great Siena altarpiece in the cathedral there, the Siena Cathedral. It's a massive, as you can see, like 7 foot high, 13 foot. And it would actually be carried through the streets when it was first made. There was a big parade and a ceremony as it was carried from his studio, to the cathedral. But understand, even though now we have one person's name on it, you can be sure that many people still worked on this. It's massive. This is the front. And this is the back. It didn't sit against a wall, it sat out so that you could walk around it and you could see front and back. The image on the right with all these small scenes, this is actually a digitally created image, because these small panels are not together. They've been dispersed all over the world. They're in museums all over the world. But apparently, we know where they were originally. So with our technology, we just reconstructed it digitally. And they're all just scenes from the life of Christ, dynamic scenes. I'll show you one of them in a moment. This side is the formal scene. It's Mary with the Christ child. It's meant to represent All Souls Day. It's the more conservative between the front and the back. There are 20 angels and 10 saints. There are 4 patron saints here in the front, patron saints of Siena, the city of Siena. It's a formal design, symmetrical, Mary in the center in a very formal way, very balanced, while the scenes, and very elegant and beautiful scene. You can see it a little better here, the elegance of the grand throne, etc. While the back, with its individual little vignettes, is much more dynamic. It's asymmetrical as opposed to symmetrical, which gives it a dynamic quality. Symmetrical designs are stable and fixed and often very formal, where asymmetrical are more dynamic because you're physically pulling the eye off to a focus off center. So very dynamic scene, a lot of movement and energy and action. So really quite different. Notice, however, though, it's still governed by the gold skies in the background. It's not Giotto, it's still Duccio. But there's an elegance of the French Gothic. There's a Byzantine quality to the use of the gold, and maybe a little bit of Giotto's spatial concerns in the placement here. So it's a mix of styles, and it's called the Sienese style. But we're getting in the 14th century some truly beautiful pieces, and I think this is one of the most beautiful pieces of the century. It's an altar piece, of course, all these are, by Martini and Memmi. It's an Annunciation scene with 2 local saints. Let me see who their names are, because I can never remember, because I'd never really heard of them. Saint Ancinous, one of Siena's patron saints, and then very possibly Ancinous' mother, or somebody said it could be Saint Margaret. We're not really sure, but it's beautiful. I mean, this is the most stunning use of gold leaf that I've ever seen. It's a Virgin of Modesty, and that's when Gabriel shows up and she sort of pulls back or covers up. That's the Virgin of Modesty, generally associated particularly with the Annunciation, and it's laid out in this beautiful symmetry. But right in the center, we have the white lilies, symbolizing purity of the Virgin Mary, and then up here, these little winged angelic figures. Have some details, you can see it a little bit better. Here are these little winged angelic figures with the Holy Spirit. Here, these appear to be prophets, Old Testament prophets. When you see some old person with a big white beard holding a scroll, 90% of the time it's an Old Testament prophet, and they're holding some prophecy that they made. So that's simply the motif for identifying them. You can see that tooled in here into the gold leaf are some words. It says, "Behold the handmaid of the Lord," Gabriel speaking to Mary.
Is this fresco?
No, this is painting. These are all, this is painting. good question. I didn't make that clear. So was the whole altarpieces are not frescoes. If it's freestanding, it's at this point, it's going to be a wooden panel painted with tempera and gold leaf. Here's a closer view of the angel. There's just an elegance here. To me, this demonstrates the Sienese style better than Duccio's did even, because I think he's really captured that French elegance in the piece. And I love this tooling of the letters, Ave Gratia. I don't remember it in Latin, how it starts. And here's the Virgin Mary. Here you can see that blue. They're still using that same blue. Here's a little bit of, it's not a spider, although it looks like one. It's a Byzantine starburst. You know, they like the Byzantine icons would have those little starbursts, and that's what it is. Look at the detail of the tooling here in the gold leaf. I just use it. They would use tools like bone, usually bone tools of different shapes, and then just sort of pounce it, hit it into the gold leaf, creating these. It mimics what happens with mosaic. Remember, mosaics would be at different angles and the light would catch them. But if you tool flat gold leaf, you get the same result. The light's going to hit it at different angles and flicker across the surface. I just wanted to.
Her eyes, the Oriental eyes.
I think she's supposed to just be looking weary. I think they're trying to make her look, she's frightened. I mean, she's meant to be frightened, and I think that's what it's meant to look. We take it that way. I think she looks angry, you know, she looks kind of angry. A lot of things like this just develop. Yeah, what? Go away.
How do you get the gold leaf to bind onto the?
You use what's called red bold. You know, everything like then it's the same way they did it with the Byzantine icons. There's underpainting, there's layers of painting. In the same way they would paint the flesh with this terre verte, or this green underpainting. Gold leaf has a red underpainting. It's called bole, B-O-L-E, and it's like a thick paint with a little bit of glue in it and you paint it with that, and then you lay down these sheets thin, and they just sort of melt on the surface when you lay them there. And you know, of course, they still rub off and age sometimes, but this one's in pretty good shape. Yeah, it's just beautiful. It's one of my favorite pieces. But you need to know that we have a beautiful lipomeme. The same person who worked with this worked on this one. There were two of them. Now this is just Meme himself in the Nelson Gallery. And you know, I just find it so sad. We have 3 beautiful Renaissance pieces. We don't have a lot from this period of this 14th century. We only have 3, but they're really fine works. They're some of the finest works there, and nobody looks at them. They're in the same room with the big knight on horseback right there, and everybody walks in and sees that and walks right past these paintings. They don't, their attention is just drawn away from it, but they're go in that room and look. And there are 3 different ones from this period, and this is a really good example of the Sienese school. So check out our Meme.
You should lead us on a field trip.
I know.
Show us these special things.
Yeah, but then nobody bid on it at the auction. That's why I auction them off. We'll do that. Been doing that for years. You're right, though. We should do it.
Oh, you
because
you do it. A field trip.
I do. I've been auctioned. That's what I auction off, is a tour of the Nelson Gallery. But I've also told my friends that anytime you want to go to the Nelson Gallery, I'm up for it. So I still mean that. So anytime, you know, it would be nice to do it with this group, because we've just talked about these things. This would be the time to do it. And I've still got the Asia tour coming up next. Still haven't done that, but that's coming up.
Well, I think one of the reasons we don't see those in people is that you don't like that style of art. You haven't ever studied it. Here's this virgin looking.
I know.
You know, she's kind of green because I guess the egg tempera.
Yeah, it's just worn off.
And then there's that funny looking Jesus.
Yeah.
And you know, it just puts.
I agree. I think too many people believe that art should be instantly accessible. I mean, if you think I should get everything right away, and if I don't, well, then hell with it.
Yeah.
You know, but that's not the case. There's no reason it should be accessible or that you should like. You've got to make an effort. You've got to learn if you really want to. They're learnable, but I totally get that that there's no interest in something you don't know anything about. I've felt that way about everything I've ever learned. The minute you learn something about it, it's a whole different thing. So yeah, I get it. I'm not upset when people don't like things. It's not their fault, but not everybody has to be out loving art. But I find it, from the Byzantine icon to this late medieval painting, an interesting sort of transition has happened. And when you think about all the things that have been happening in art in between them, and yet how similar they still are. I mean, the same motif is still what's dominating. It's the same visual language in general, but changes are beginning to happen.
Is that first one a fresco?
None of these are frescoes. These are all tempera
Okay.
paintings.
It's
That's an
just-
icon.
It's so, there's so many, blotchy.
It's just in bad shape. I mean, all the gold, that's the red bowl underneath. All that was gold leaf. The gold leaf is worn off. You can see a little bit here, but whenever you see red like this, that used to be gold. Wherever you see green, that used to be flesh tone. It's just worn off. But, look at the child, the proportions are a heck of a lot better than they were here. And you don't have all these stylized starburst light things. It's much more physical. This is more physical in many ways than the other. So let's talk about these transitional ideas, because we're about to enter the Renaissance. And you know what that means? Is I change books. We're about to enter the Renaissance. So here's what happens in this change. Emulation of the ancients was beginning, and particularly their interest in physicality. That's what we think of when we talk about the classical Greco-Roman world. Influence of Franciscan order, simplicity, humility, looking, getting out into the world, new importance of experience and observation, rejection of medievalisms. So let's talk, well, we're not quite into the, we're into the, we call it the proto-Renaissance. It's a period in Flanders in the 15th century. It's generally considered Renaissance. They'll call it Northern Renaissance as a code word for almost Renaissance, or proto is the word I like because that comes from my background in archaeology. It implies it is, but there's still one foot on the other side. So it's sort of, it's not proto is not the same as pre-Renaissance means before Renaissance. Proto means it really is Renaissance, but it's still holding on to some old
What
things.
was happening politically that changed this? Can tell me in 10 words.
To change what? I'm not sure the question.
What was happening politically in
It depends
France at this
where.
time?
Oh,
Or
well,
wherever. I guess it was in Italy. We're still in Italy.
no, now we're jumping up to Flanders right now. We're about to jump up to Flanders. Okay, I can tell you politically why these changes are happening in Flanders. Flanders is right up here, and it's basically modern day Belgium and Netherlands. And they were by this time becoming the richest center in all of Europe. Amsterdam, The Hague, these are the wealthiest ports in Europe at this time. And art follows money. Wherever the money is growing, you have people with extra money to spend, you have patrons who want to spend money on art, and that's where the artists are going to be. So it's economic development is good for the arts. Economic poverty is bad for the arts in general, in terms of patronage. Not in terms of what people have to talk about, but in terms of how much money there is to support the arts.
Was that when the tulips came?
That's what I was
became
gonna
a
ask.
commodity?
At this time, they were already, yes, this is, and it's not just tulips. By the 17th century, they are the largest supporter of flowers of all kinds around the world. I think they probably still are. I don't know that that's the case, but they certainly were in the 17th century. So let's talk about Flanders and really the development of now, not just single panels, but large altar pieces, plural. And this is where we begin to see the complexity of altars with triptychs, 3-panel pieces, diptych, triptych. They don't have the term here, but I usually just call them diptychs, triptychs, and polyptychs. Polyptych just means many, many, many panels all together. Other term, predella. I want to talk about the predella. So we're going to look at that. The predella is a horizontal space below the main altar, and it's going to, a certain motif will develop for the predellas. Those are the only terminologies. You know, we call these wings. Generally, panels like this will have, since they're hinged, you could fold these two in and close them, so they will have an outside image painted on the outside. Then you open it up and there's an inside image. Typically, panels would be closed most of the time, but opened on holy days. Some of them have multiple levels of opening panels, might be opened on Sunday, and then the next level's opened on holy days. So it's complicated, but this is the source for painting. I also want to talk about a new paint that begins in Flanders, and that is oil paint. Oil paint's going to change everything, absolutely everything in art. The Renaissance is built on what oil paint can do as opposed to what tempera could do. There are things you can and cannot do with different kinds of paint, and the type of paint they'd been using simply wouldn't work for what they wanted to show. That the detail and the depth of naturalism of Renaissance art is not possible in tempera. It is in oil. The difference is the binder. Instead of using egg yolk, you add a little linseed oil. It's not water-based now, so you have to use turpentine as a vehicle, but that's the main difference. It's also painted in layers. The way they painted really up until the mid-19th century was using a technique called glazing, which is painting in many, many layers, painting semi-translucently, having a lot of oil so that when it dries, the light passes through all the layers. Notice here how the light is literally bouncing. They would often do an underpainting of tempera, that at least at this time. They don't do that by the Renaissance, but in the early 15th century, 14th and early 15th century. And then the light penetrates and bounces out. So it creates this depth to the color and this depth. They would also create color through layering. Like if I wanted to get a certain deep tone of red, I might do sort of a blue color and then a lighter color here and a lighter color here. And then as the light bounces through the layers, it mixes those colors optically, and what you see is different from in the colors that were mixed. It's very likely that the color you see was never actually mixed. It's created by the light as it passes through different levels. And then a varnish level, or sometimes called the glaze, would be put at the top. So it's a long process because oil takes forever to dry. Typically artists would be working on many paintings at the same time because you'd have to let them, each layer has to dry before you paint the next one. And that could take a couple of months or more, depending on how thin the layer was. And that's why some oil paintings you'll see are just covered with cracks, or craquelure it's called, cracks everywhere. That's what happens when you don't let each layer dry properly. Others are just pristine. And that's because they did let the layers dry properly. So you can really tell the difference. So we'll see. The kinds of colors you get from oil are unprecedented in their depth and their brilliance and their mixing. So it's really hard to mix a lot of tempera color. It doesn't mix well, dries really fast. Tempera dries fast, egg dries fast. At the most you might be able to get, if you're painting something red, you'll get 3 reds, a light, a dark, and a middle, and that's all you can really paint with. With oil, because it stays wet, you can mix an infinite range of colors, which is what you need to get believable, say, modeling of a form. You need all these range of colors that you can't get. I just want to show you this, see the scale. This is a small altarpiece meant for a private little chapel. Very famous, called the Merode altarpiece. I've seen this. This is in New York. It's at the Cloisters Museum. If you've never gotten up to the north tip in Manhattan, nobody goes up there. And it's where a lot of this special medieval stuff is. And it's a quiet little place, and it's really worth going up there. to see. It's oil. It's by the master of Flamel. We don't know who he was. We call him the master of Flamel. And it's 3 panels. The central panel is the Annunciation. And then we'll talk about the other 2 panels in a second. What we have here is the interior. It's taking place in the interior of a Flemish home.
I feel like leaving, like it's a fire drill or something.
I know. No, he's putting in the sound system. That's what they're working on in Conover, is the sound system. So be glad we're in here and the door is closed. It must be horrible out there. So think about that. You know, when we look at this, I mean, it all looks so out of place to us. I don't think its strangeness hits us the way it would have at the time. I mean, imagine now a scene of the Annunciation taking place in your living room. Now that would be strange. Well, that's what it looked like then, because this is a contemporary home. They're placing it not only in the real world, but in your real world, in your home. So one of the complaints by the 15th century within the church was that religion had been taken so far out of everyone's understandable daily lives that it was sort of beyond. There was a call to bring religious storytelling back down to earth, in the sense that make people feel that they can identify with it, that it's applicable to their lives. And so this is one attempt to do that. Well, what if I put this scene in an ordinary home? Would you be able to identify with that a little bit more? It wasn't done very often. There are other ways to do that, but that's the reason why it was set that way. So
The guy on the right.
Oh, no, this is Joseph in his workshop, and we'll look at that detail in a minute. And we'll talk about who those people are on the left in just a moment. So he's trying to give us a real space. So he's angling the walls and lifting the floor line to create a kind of little box for this to take place. Although it's not like really accurately done, because they don't quite yet know how to do that, at least not in Flanders yet. The table is tilted up. It's also still full of medieval symbolism. It's just full of little details like the white cloth that symbolizes a purity. This symbolizes a vessel most pure, which is Mary. You've got the white lilies. You've got the candle that is just blown out, which I'll talk about in just a moment. She's a virgin of humility, so she's sitting down on the floor. I mean, it's filled with little details of symbols. That's very medieval. Those are going to completely disappear in the Renaissance. Let's look at a detail. Here's a detail of the corner up here. Now, one of the things, we call it the Annunciation, but it's really more than that, because, and I love this, sliding down these little gold leaf beams of light is a tiny little baby carrying a cross. That's the baby Jesus, who's sliding right down here to this little starburst to her womb. This is the most medieval thing about this, is this narrative that's sort of unfolding, where you have Christ sliding down into her womb. So it's not just the Annunciation, it's the incarnation as well. So in other words, he is incarnated in her womb, even as the angel is predicting it. And then at the same time, the candle is going out, which is a symbol of the incarnation, that Christ has taken form. It's also related to the marriage candle, which is in a lot of art, which when blown out symbolizes a consummation of the marriage. So it's a little bit of all of that symbolism happening in this scene, and that is medieval. Even within the midst of all these brilliant colors and this oil paint. The panel on the right here is Joseph in his workshop as a carpenter. This little object on his table here is similar to the little object you see out here. Do you know what that is? Yes, it's a medieval mousetrap. It is. No, it's a mousetrap, which again is symbolic, because we've seen the mice symbolizing Satan, whatever. So he's trapping Satan. But what I want to show you is the detail out the window. So that's this little detail. Remember, this whole thing isn't very high. So this detail here is tiny. The style of working in oil is in Flanders at this time is a continuation of how they worked in tempera, which was to use tiny, tiny little brushes, sometimes even 1 or 2 hair brushes, and work on fine little detail. They worked in what's called a linear style, which is where you just make tiny little lines right next to one another, and they just sort of melt together. It's never a brush stroke visible at all. And we're all familiar with a lot of ways of painting where you see big chunky brush strokes. Well, that's not this. This is very, very fine, and it's called a linear style. So when they start working in, you kind of have to work that way in tempera, and because of the nature of the paint working with, I've worked with real egg. The tempera you buy today in tubes and bottles does not work the same way it does when you really just break an egg and mix it with water. It's very different, and you have to work differently. So they're still working that way in oil, but that you don't have to work that way in oil, and they will soon figure that out, that you don't have to work that way, and they'll learn totally different ways to work with oil. But look at the detail. You feel like you could magnify this little thing and bring it up, and it would still be the fine detail. So it's this microscopic detail of form.
It seems to me they're trying to show off their knowledge of perspective.
They are
Yeah,
trying to
but-
it's an intuitive knowledge. It's not a scientific knowledge, but you're right. They are trying to show off the knowledge of how to create space, but they're also trying to show off their knowledge of how to work with oil, because
Oh, yeah.
these techniques developed in individual workshops, and they were considered industrial secrets. I mean, you didn't want anybody else to know how you did this, so some workshops use this under layer of tempera. Some, for a long time, it was hard for us to know exactly what they were mixing in and how they were doing it, because these were closely guarded secrets. This is how you got the commissions when other people didn't.
I think that's the only picture of Mary I've ever seen that when she didn't wear a blue dress.
Yeah, but I think, yeah, you're right. But I think, well, that's because no, you do see it. You don't notice it. The blue mantle is over the top of this. And there are many pictures in which you see a little bit of red here. The undergarment is red. She's in her home now, so she's taken off her outer garment. But this is the underdress.
Okay.
And that's almost always red. You just don't see a bit. You might see a little bit of red right here. Look at some of those earlier ones and you'll see little bits of it. But yeah, you're right. She's not in the blue mantle because she's relaxed, and
What is the tool that Joseph is using? I don't recognize.
it's a drill.
Oh,
We used to have one of these. My dad had one of those. I remember playing with it. It was fun. Like you go around like that. And
But I find it
Drill a hole in the
fascinating that we
coffee table.
see so much about their life.
yeah.
Doing that.
But it seems to be more, it's a 15th century Flemish life. It's not really Mary and Joseph's life. But the most interesting people in the whole picture are these two. Anybody want to guess who those two are?
Clergy.
Who?
Clergy.
No, it's hard to tell because of the clothes, but no, those are just, okay. They're ordinary 15th century garments. If we read this as a continuous space, that doesn't appear to be, but this, he's opening the door and peeking in. These are what we call the donors or the patrons. These are the two people, the husband and wife, who paid for the altarpiece, commissioned it, paid for it, and it belonged to them. They got their picture in it but they're not in it. They're not in this scene. They're out here opening the door and looking in. Now, there's been some recent work that has made the suggestion, and I think it's a really interesting one, that it's meant to imply a vision. Not that this is happening in their home, but they're opening the door and having a vision of this scene happening in their home, which is interesting because there are other works of art, and we'll look at some that kind of also suggest that their visions are, in some cases, you have to read it that way. It's clear that that's how to read it. So that would be interesting. It would make a lot more sense than implying this took place there, but that he would have a vision of it makes more sense. So yeah, they are the patrons or the donors, and we will definitely see them. You can almost always recognize them because they're a sort of contemporary couple, but they're kind of just on the outside, not quite in, but sort of outside looking in. Good guess, that's probably who they are.
What about the
Who's
character?
in the really back, that little guy?
Oh,
behind-
a lot of people have wondered who that guy is. There have been any number of suggestions, but nobody knows who that guy is.
Probably a banker.
Oh, ooh, somebody has suggested the artist. That's, that's an interesting suggestion. So, but we really just don't know. But the fact that he's there and you see him tells me it's not just an arbitrary thing, that he's somebody. I think the artist is a good suggestion. I agree.
And there is no name of the artist?
Master of Flamand. We don't know who the artist was. Flamand means just, Flanders. He's the master of the Flemish style. There's a lot of different master of this, master of that. It's like, we know these 5 paintings were done by this guy. We got to call him something. So we'll call him the master of Flamand.
What's Merode, the name of the town?
Oh, someone who owned it at a later date.
Oh.
Someone who owned it at some point in time. The name is on it, usually in some inventory list. And then which one are you talking about? Oh, the Merode, the one that Merode donated, or, that they're somewhat arbitrary names. Sometimes it's where it was for a while or who owned it for a while. I want to look at really one of the most magnificent altarpieces by Jan and Hubert van Eyck, 2 brothers. Jan, we believe that Jan was the painter and that Hubert was the frame maker, but it may not be that simple. They had a huge workshop. They were the most sought after workshop in all of Flanders. They had the best secrets, the best formulas, and everybody wanted the Van Eycks. They are the essence of Northern Renaissance or Proto-Renaissance, whatever you want to call it. An incredible frame. This is how it's displayed today. So you can go around and see different sides because there are paintings on front and back and open and closed views. Really beautiful scene. These 2 figures up here are in black and white because they are not there. I don't know whether they're missing. I don't think they're missing. I think they might have been removed for cleaning or something like that. But that tells us that we're not looking at the actual painting. We're going to look at the closed view and then open it up because it's a polyptych. There are many different panels of different sizes and scales. The closed view is a really interesting one, very complex one. So it's oil paint on wood. They're still painting on wood. We're quite a ways before canvas is used yet. We're another 100 years and in another location. But oil paint now on wood.
Paint on wood. Isn't there cloth
It's
covering
sprayed,
wood?
yeah, it's covering it. And it would have all sorts of things preparing the surface. So it would be a really hard, shiny marble surface, hard, smooth surface that you actually paint on with wood panel as a support. But when I say canvas, I mean like loose canvas, movable with texture. And that's a whole different way of working. So oil paint on wood. It's known as the Ghent altarpiece because it's located in Ghent, in the city of Ghent. It is a polyptych. And it was originally in the Church of St. John. The patrons were Jodicus Vede and his wife, Isabella Bortut, and recognize them. Here and here is the husband and wife down here. His name was John, and his patron saint was John. And at that time, it was the Church of St. John. It's now the Cathedral of St. Bavo, but it's important that at the time it was the Church of St. John. And down here by them, we have sculptures of the 2 St. Johns, John the Baptist and John the Evangelist, or young St. John. So let's talk about these 3 levels, because there are 3 levels here, really. We have this upper level with these circular sort of arches above them, refers to sort of an ancient time, because we have 2 Old Testament prophets, right? Old guys with beards and scrolls in front of them, Old Testament prophets. And then the women, when you see women, younger women, those are always sibyls. They're Greek sibyls, but they were also prophets. They foretold the future in the Greek world. So they're linking modern Christianity and ancient Greek world, showing them all having people who could foretell the future. I mean, which is right there, really another astonishing difference of using something from ancient mythology, mixing it with Christian stories, and on a religious altarpiece. It's just really kind of unheard of. The next level is meant to be read as a single scene. It's the upper room of the interior of a church. in which we have the Annunciation. So here we have Gabriel and all the accompanying symbolism. And then over here, a Virgin of Humility, because she's sort of kneeling with the dove above her head, the Holy Spirit above her head, and we'll look at some details in a minute. And then I've already said what's down here. So what's intriguing about the program, because it's a single overall program, the whole thing, is it gives us 3 points in time, 3 moments in time, where we have the ancient world here, which would be biblical and before. This is New Testament time, which is where we have Mary and the angels. And then the lower level is the contemporary time, which is where we have the 2 donors and the sculptures of the 2 St. Johns, because they did not live in 15th century. So the only way you could have them on this level is as sculpture. If they existed on this level, you could show them as people, because they existed in time on this level. So see that orderliness, that sense of clarity in telling the story. This painting technique, this is all painting. So this painting technique to create the illusion of sculpture is called grisaille. And I don't know if I have a detail of that. Yeah, I do. Grisaille, which just means painting in black and white to create the illusion of sculpture. I mean, that's literally what the word means. I see this misused constantly. It doesn't mean painting in black and white. Just because you're painting in black and white doesn't mean gray, that mean that it's grisaille. Grisaille refers to the illusion of a sculpture. It's really well done. The believability of this piece is really incredible. Their ability to create texture, that's something you can't do in tempera, but with oil, creating the illusion of the furs and the like. We'll look at some other details in a minute. Here's the middle layer, and you can see what it says here. It says, he says, hail, hail full of grace, the Lord is with thee. And Mary is saying, behold, the handmaid of the Lord. But I believe that this is written upside down and backwards. It's not backwards, it's just upside down because you're spinning it upside down. So if you were above looking down, this is what you would read. So it's either written for the prophet above who is looking down at her, or the dove. But it reminds me of those Greek vases where they would write things backwards if they were coming out of your mouth.
Because he's speaking to her and the words go this way.
His words
She's
go that,
answering him and it goes this way.
but why write? Maybe. It's just that the Greeks would have just written the word backwards.
Yeah.
In this case, they're spinning it upside down, but it could be, maybe they, yeah, I mean, it's as logical as anything else. That could very well be it. But detail, look at that, out that window again. Still some symbolism, not as much, but you still have the vessel most pure, as it's called. You still have the white towel and the lilies. So let's open it. When we open it, this is what we see. Okay, here's something new. God the Father. That is not Jesus. That's the first image of God.
I'm amazed.
Whoa, God.
Yes.
Yep, God. It's not just God, but it's the Trinity. So we have Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, notice how they're oddly sized and shaped. These panels, the angel choir and this angel choir, both came from another panel. They were part of panels that were on an organ doors that covered like a big church organ, and they were removed from that and used here, which is why the odd sizes. And it worked okay because you could put Adam and Eve in little tiny skinny ones and make them fit. But it's odd that, you know, these 2 panels are this size, the 2 above it are odd sized, and that's why they were sort of repurposed. The only nude figures we've seen in all of, you know, for 1,000 years were Adam and Eve, and you didn't see them very often in their little niches. Mary and John the Baptist here on either side of God. We'll look at some details. Down below, this is one of the most famous pieces, this is the Adoration of the Lamb, and we'll look at details of that It's great symbolism of groups. This whole level is all about different groups coming together, sort of again, like an All Saints Day. We've got, I have to consult my notes because I can never remember which group is which. These are the just judges, as they're called, the Christian knights. And then we've got apostles, martyrs, confessors, and virgins. The virgin, and these are the confessors over here. Over here we get the pilgrims, holy pilgrims, and the holy hermits. Back here we get other groups. We'll look at more detail in just a minute and see that. So it's like all different groups. One of the panels, this one, the Just Judges, is a modern painting. That painting, just that panel was stolen, I don't remember when, quite a while ago. And so it's been replaced. So this is not the original panel, but all the other panels are original. Here's our Adam, our view of Adam. And he's painted as a person, but this deep, dark shadow behind him, that was almost impossible to do with tempera. You can't do black with tempera. It's just too translucent. You can't get the deep, dark colors. You need oil for that. Here's the detail of God. This is what you can do with oil. This is what wowed everyone, because oil paint is opaque and not translucent. You can put white on top of a color. You can't get highlights in tempera. Only way you could do it is with gold leaf. That's why they use gold on top to get highlights. Now you can just use white paint, and you can do things like this, just little dots of white. The illusion you can create in terms of jewels and metallic surfaces and reflections is incredible in oil. This is what wowed everybody. I mean, it still wows everybody. You can imagine what it did then. Look at the textures of the different fabrics, the folds, the naturalness of the folds with all the different variations of the reds and colors. You know, some reference to the gold left in places like this, but the papal tiara, he's wearing the papal tiara and all of the jewels encrusted. It's absolutely beautiful detailing. This is the adoration. We get the Deus Agni. Deus Agni is an image that appeared, this is still medieval, again, medievalisms within the oil paint. Deus Agni, Agnus is Latin for lamb. So Deus Agni is Lamb of God, and it's typically shown in art, medieval art and others. In Northern Europe, it's used later, well into the 15th century. It's hard to see. I don't think I have a detail. Oh, I do. The blood, this is the blood of Christ pouring into the chalice, right? The body of Christ, he's the Lamb of God. So Ecce Agnus Dei, that's what it says down here. Behold, the Lamb of God. So this is Christ. So then, well, so if that's Christ, well, I'll come back to that. I just have to show you detail. Look at the detail in these buildings. You know that dozens, if not hundreds of people worked on this because it would have taken forever. I thought I had a full, let's go back to the full. Okay, so here's our Trinity right down the middle, Father, the Son, and the white dove is the Holy Spirit. So it's anchored symmetrically with those. And then here's the tiny little building that we were just looking at, blown all the way up. The other thing I'd point out there, over here, somebody else worked on this and discovered this in several panels, and we're used to it now. It's combining two types of trees, palm trees and cypress trees that do not grow in the same place, that can't really ever be in the same place. So it becomes a symbol. I knew somebody who worked on this in her dissertation, looking at 19th century art, finding this symbolism as a way of symbolizing something like a holy place, because you've got this happening and this happening at the same time, and they can't happen at the same time. So therefore, this is heaven, like a symbol of a heavenly place. And I think, yeah, that takes us.
Was that radical to portray God?
Yes.
Imagine
Yeah.
how the public could accept that. Or,
well, because they it wasn't radical anymore. It's just things have changed. Times have changed.
They've never done it very much.
No, they never did. Well, they don't do it much late. You know, it's never been done a lot, but it was like taboo in the Middle Ages. It just shows how far they've come, that it's no longer
I
taboo.
wonder why they wouldn't do a Jesus with somebody making him a lamb instead of a.
Well, that symbolizes Jesus. That is, I mean, it's the Agnus Dei. It's an important, it's like any iconic image. It's like the cross. It says more than, if you were just a picture of Jesus, it would say nothing except Jesus. But by showing the Lamb of God, it speaks of sacrifice. It speaks of the Eucharist and the blood of Christ. And it has more meaning. You know, an iconic form is more meaningful. That's the whole nature of medieval art. They believed that realism doesn't tell you as much as a spiritual iconic image can tell you, because it brings with it a lot more meaning.
Well,
So
was it ever sinful to do this? I mean, did they kill people? for
no,
having,
I don't,
like,
no, it just
the-
wouldn't have been done. Well, you know, in the Middle Ages, the church had to approve everything, so it just wouldn't have been done. It wouldn't have happened. I mean, it was,
think the Jews still don't.
well, they're more iconic, they're more iconoclastic, yes. And of course,
mean, they
Islam is iconoclastic as well.
But they don't paint either. Or do they?
Well, I'm not an expert in Judaica. That's a whole different study of art that I have just the vaguest understanding of. So I don't talk about it all that much. What I love is that he's wearing the papal crown. And when God wears the papal crown, that's a powerful symbol.
Yeah.
I mean, the Pope would have loved that part of it. So yeah, that's different. And it does emphasize the Trinity in a profound way. And I don't know enough about what's happening at that exact moment in terms of religion, but it could be there were some challenges to Trinitarianism. I don't know. Maybe there was a need felt to emphasize the Trinity. So I'm not real sure of that.
Is there a hint of red on Mary's right arm? You mentioned.
Yes,
red.
yes, yes. Let's see if we can find it. Yep, look,
Yeah, right
a
there.
hint of red. Yep, very good. Now we'll all go looking for it. But there, I can remember other works. You can see it more up around her neck. Anybody have any other questions on this piece or?
Beautiful colors.
Yeah, aren't they? I just love the details in the
Where
letter.
are they? Where is this?
It's still in the church of St. Bavo in Ghent, in the Netherlands. So, yeah. Let's all go there and look.
Yeah, I go.
Yeah, that's,
Sign me up.
yeah, right. That's the ticket. Well, in the midst of all of this, we actually have the Black Death. 1348 is the worst year of it. That is also going to help contribute to the beginning of the Renaissance, because it's going to thin out the population of Italy quite dramatically. We'll talk about that next time. So that's where we are. I was hoping we'd get started on 15th century. We didn't, but anyway, next time we start on that.
Along with the Lamb of God, you've got the cross and everything.
Yep.
So all these symbols you were talking about.
Right. It's still full of medieval. Well,
My
you,
granddaughter saw one of those things. She said, "Who is that? What is that?" And Joe said, "That's the Lamb of God." And she said, "I didn't know he had a lamb."
I didn't know he had a lamb. Yeah, God had a lamb. No, yeah, the Agnus Dei. Anyway, that gets us really through the Middle Ages. So what we're starting with, you know, technically we look at the Renaissance as beginning 15th century is the first century of the Renaissance. So right around soon after 1400, we see sort of all these earlier ideas pulled together, and we begin to see simplification, but we also see different styles. Unlike the Middle Ages, that was so controlled by the church, where so many things looked very much alike. The fact that we don't have that in the same way, you're going to get a lot of different styles in Renaissance art. So I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, everybody.